as you know, the umbrella for this day is enterprise and investigation. We're going to continue on that theme right now with Chris Hamby. He's with Buzzfeed now. He's just recently moved to Buzzfeed. Previously, he was with the Center for Public Integrity, where he worked on a story that he's going to talk to us about, which won the Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting. He is a prize-winning reporter even before that. Actually, I think this story also got the Poe Award, is that right? He has 2 Edgar A. Poe Memorial Awards from the White House Correspondents Association, among other honors. He's computer-assisted reporting. Some reporters come to journalism from a lot of different paths. They do different things, and then they sort of focus on journalism. Not this guy. Bachelor's in journalism and a master's in journalism. Just knew what you wanted to do and aimed for it, and now you're obviously doing it very, very well. So thank you for being here, and we look forward to hearing about this story.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. I am not very professorial, so feel free to interrupt, ask me questions, whatever you want to do. If I put something up here that doesn't make sense or you want me to elaborate on, go for it. So I thought I'd start a little bit just by talking about how this project came about. And this, by the way, is the sort of the logo for the series, and this is a miner named Steve Day. You can see he's got oxygen. He's got his portable tank over there. So this came about the Upper Big Branch mine disaster in April 2010, killed 29 miners. Of those, 24 had enough lung tissue to where they could actually look at it on autopsy. And of those 24, 17 had signs of black lung, which is just off the charts. That is something that we looked at because there have been a number of investigative agencies that looked at the disaster afterwards. One of them was this panel appointed by the governor of West Virginia. And we actually knew someone who was on this investigative team, and she flagged, because we always are looking for what can we do that the rest of the media is not doing. And everyone was going to say, these are the causes, Massey's corporate culture and buildup of coal dust and the methane ignition and all that. And so we thought, what can we do that's different? And so she flagged this one page in this, you can see it's a 126-page report, this page 32, and there's just this one page, coal workers' pneumoconiosis, which is the term for black lung, and the Upper Big Branch miners. So this is where those findings with the 17 men with black lung that I was talking about. So we did a story pretty much just on this page, and then basically said, what the hell's going on here? And in looking at this, realized that black lung is not something that's gone away. I think a lot of people like me, when I read this, probably thought, black lung, isn't that guys like with picks and shovels in the mid 20th century? But actually, for a number of reasons, it's not. And there was landmark legislation in 1969 that, among other things, limited the amount of coal dust in mines, and then set up the benefits program that would provide compensation if guys did get the disease, but the goal was to eradicate the disease entirely. There was a precipitous decline until the late 1990s, but since then, the rate of the disease has actually been on the rise, and there's been a troubling sort of trend towards, especially in central Appalachia, so southern West Virginia, eastern Kentucky, southwestern Virginia, of younger guys getting a more progressive, nastier form of the disease. So we decided to look at that. And so we partnered with NPR and traveled the coal fields and did some stories about why this was happening. And the main government research agency that does this is called NIOSH, National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. This is their mobile unit that they take around coal country and screen miners. And so we actually got to go with them on these and see some of the stuff that they do, like spirometry. They're testing his lung function here. This is actually pretty unpleasant if you've ever done it. One of the NPR correspondents tried to do it and got a picture of him, which I won't show you, but it's not flattering. And even he with normal lung function can barely do it. So you can imagine how hard it is for these guys with impaired lung function, especially severe lung function. And so they do that. They do X-rays. This is a portable chest X-ray. So those are some of the key things that they look for when filing benefits cases. So, and we also went to the clinic of this doctor, the legendary Donald Rasmussen. This was him in 1974. He was early in the stage when black lung was first being recognized, and they first established the law on the benefits program. The idea was that it would be eradicated. He said he thought he'd be retired. Now he's in his 80s. He's still working. He's still diagnosing minors. And actually, he said he's really troubled because he's seeing this nasty form of disease that he hasn't seen in years. It's just sort of, things happen sometimes. You just kind of fall into things while you're doing a story, and sometimes just kind of being there is important. So we got a lot of color at that NIOSH van that I showed. We hung out with Dr. Rasmussen at his clinic in Beckley, West Virginia, and just talked to the minors who were coming in to get tested, and so ended up meeting Tommy Markham. And Tommy has a pretty simple stage of the disease, but so I was just, sort of a lesson here is as invasive as you think it might be, never, be hesitant to ask someone, say, can I watch them put a catheter in your arm and, do all this invasive testing to you? And he said, why not? He was just talking to me the whole time, and then he started talking about his brother who had black lung, and then his other brother who had black lung, and then his dad who had black lung. So there's these four. So this is Ray, Donald, James. Every one of these guys has black lung disease to varying degrees. Complicated, severe, simple, basic, simple. And essentially, he was an older generation of miners. These guys all worked after the 1969 law was passed. Their lungs should not be the way that they are. And so that really sort of was a core sort of frame for the story, is why are there men like Tommy, James, and Donald Markham? So we ended up with this story, and NPR did a couple of stories. And as we were, and this is obviously Ray and Tommy, this was at a picnic in Prestonsburg, Kentucky. And, that's another thing, is they just, sometimes just being there, you get all kinds of great stuff. And this, of course, ended up, a lot of the story was sort of framed around some of their interactions that I thought were pretty telling at this family reunion. But as we were recording this story, we were going around West Virginia and Kentucky. And we were talking to advocates and some lawyers and a lot of miners. And what we kept hearing was, the benefit system is so stacked. It's incredibly rigged. I can't win. Everyone I know who has black lung, they can't win. They've lost their case 2-3 times. It's dragged on for years, maybe decades. They have these doctors who always say no. They have these lawyers who just bury you in paperwork and who knows what to do. And so I thought, well, that does suck. But how am I going to tell that story? I mean, it's, everyone I talked to described it as essentially a very complex litigation system with its own sort of particular rules, which it does. And it often devolves into a battle of competing medical experts. And what do you do with that as a journalist? Do you want to just do a story that says, they credited one judge over the one doctor over the other? it's very difficult to conceive of how to get into that story, so I didn't. And I just kind of put it on the back burner for a while. But I just kept hearing these stories from these miners and from their families and from these advocates. And I think what finally broke through for me was hearing the story of Gary Fox. So this is Gary in the mine. This is his roof bolting machine. So when they carve out a new area of the mine, he's the first one in. He has this machine that drives bolts into the top to pin the less secure rock to higher rock that's more secure so that the roof doesn't cave in. It's a very dangerous job. It exposes them to high levels of dust that can cause black lung. So I was given the civil complaint of what happened in Gary's case. And it was one of those things where I just looked at it and said, if this is true, or even if 80% of this is true, this is appalling, and I have to look into this. And to give you an idea of basically what happened to Gary, Gary had worked for 25 years underground doing some of these high exposure jobs like this. And including the last little bit for a subsidiary of Massey Energy, which of course was the Upper Big Branch run by Don Blankenship, has a pretty unpleasant health and safety record. So in 1998, doctors saw something on an x-ray, a weird mass, and they wanted to see what it was. They wanted to make sure it wasn't cancer, basically, because that's the main concern when you see something like that. So they go in, take a piece of his lung, look at it, and they say, it's not cancer. And they give some sort of vague diagnosis of inflammatory pseudotumor, which really doesn't mean anything. It's just, it kind of looks like a tumor, but it probably was some inflammatory disease, but we don't really know what it is. There's no evidence that they knew, that the doctor looking at it knew that he was a miner, or that, let alone that he did these jobs that would expose him to high levels of dust. So he has that in his medical record. He files for benefits in 1999 because he's so bad. And that's when the law firm Jackson Kelly comes in. And this law firm is sort of the preeminent firm for black lung defense and a lot of coal company defense. They've been around for 200 years, serving primarily the coal industry and other energy extraction, but really coal is their thing. And so they got the case. They were representing Massey, which it's since become Alpha Natural Resources. But so Gary was not able to find a lawyer, because this is fairly common in these cases, because lawyers are not allowed to charge anything for their time while the case is ongoing. And then if you lose, you get nothing. If you win, you have to petition for attorney's fees, in which case the coal company's lawyers will then litigate against you, sometimes for years, to try and stop you from getting attorney's fees. And I've seen things like, you didn't need a paralegal to make that copy, this should only be billed at, this rate per hour. It's just, they fight over absolutely everything. And that's sort of the strategy. It's deterrent. And so no lawyers want to take these cases, and miners are reluctant to file these cases. So Gary's in there, he and his wife are by himself. The other side are these lawyers at this firm that have been doing this for years and years, and they know everything in and out. So the pathology ended up being crucial. That piece of lung that they took from Gary in 1998. Gary really didn't know the significance of that, but the lawyers at Jackson Kelly clearly did, because they relied heavily upon it. And what happened was they used that report from the hospital pathologist and basically showed it to all their doctors and said, does this mean that he doesn't have black lung regardless of what anything else shows? And they said basically yes, and that's what the judge said too. Denied benefits in 2001. What is crucial is what the firm did not submit, is these two reports that they got. So Richard Noya, Raphael Caffrey are well-known, prominent doctors in the field. They have years of experience looking for black lung. They frequently testify for Jackson Kelly because their opinions often support the firm's case. But in this case, unbeknownst to Gary, they'd gotten that piece of tissue from the 1998 surgery, sent it to these two guys, and both guys came back and said it's consistent with the most severe form of black lung disease. They took these reports, they did not tell anyone about them. No one except the lawyers knew that they existed. And they instead relied on the other report from the doctor who had no knowledge of Gary's mining experience or even was looking for black lung. So as a result, he lost his case. He went back to work for 5 years, more than 5 years. He got progressively sicker, as you would imagine. This is a progressive and irreversible disease. And so it was not until late 2006 when he just couldn't go on. And then in early 2007, he was fortunate enough to find representation from this man, John Klein. So he came to the West Virginia coal fields in the 60s as a Vista volunteer. It's sort of like the domestic Peace Corps almost. Then he worked for a number of years as a carpenter and electrician. He was building homes for low-income people who qualify for government subsidies. And then he was a clinic worker and a lay representative for miners at this black lung clinic, and basically helped them with their claims. And then he decided he needed to go to law school. Now, he always jokes with me he's not a real lawyer, because all he does is black lung claims. But he's, an incredibly stalwart advocate for miners, and he's one of the few guys who's actually been doing sort of discovery in a lot of these cases. And you can see that's at the breathing clinic, and that's him right there when he was a long-haired hippie activist building homes. But this is him now. He was immediately suspicious of what had gone on in Fox's case, and so he started filing for discovery, and which is something that, for some reason, lawyers don't really do in the black lung system. And he uncovered those reports from Noya and Caffrey that showed what had actually gone on in the first case. So the challenge for me in looking at all this is everything in the black lung system is confidential, except for the final decision by the judge, which doesn't really have that much that's useful in terms of actual proof of what happened. So, what I did was identify cases that were of interest, go to those family members, go to the miners themselves, but in most cases the miners had died, so it was actually the surviving family members, and ask them, will you sign a form that says I can view all of your files in this case that the Labor Department has? And this includes a lot of really personal financial information, medical information. It's very invasive, but pretty much everyone said yes, because they felt like what had happened to them in these cases was wrong. And so I ended up with this just massive amount of documents that was ridiculous, but in there was what this firm had been doing. And it was to guys like Calvin Klein and Clarence Carroll and Norman Eller and Elmer Daugherty. All these cases are maybe not to the same degree, but similar to Fox, in that withheld evidence caused them to lose their cases, when in fact they had the most severe form of the disease. So this was sort of key to establishing a pattern, and I felt pretty good, after reviewing a number of case files, that this was the way this firm operated. Now, in looking at a lot of this, I kept coming across doctors that would just pop up over and over and over again. And that's not really surprising in a litigation context, that you would have a usual stable of experts on one side and the other side. But I think what was surprising is, well, one, in the black lung context, the disparity of resources is so remarkable compared to a typical civil litigation context. These guys don't have access to the best doctors and lawyers, but the coal companies do. And a lot of times it's who can write a better report that wins, really. But the thing that really jumped out at me in particular was one affiliation that I just kept seeing over and over and over, and it was Johns Hopkins University, specifically Paul Wheeler. He's the head of this unit. It's been operating for 40 years, and basically never finds black lung on any X-ray or CT scan. And the thing is that this logo carries a lot of weight when it's on the top of a report. Over and over again, I would see in cases judges saying, I defer to Dr. Wheeler. Dr. Wheeler has superior credentials, which he does. He has like a 3,000 page CV. I mean, it's, ridiculous. But that was why some of the files were so big. It was just his CV. But so, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, there's no, and other doctors are reading the X-rays and CT scans as positive, and I'm thinking that there's no way that in all of these cases that he's always right, that there's never black lung. But how do you prove that? This guy's at the top of his game. He went to Harvard. He's been in Hopkins forever. What do you do with that? So, what I ended up doing was, fortunately, the Labor Department, Office of Administrative Law Judges, which hears these cases, has this search page for all the decisions. And like I said, the decisions are the only things that are public. And so you can do a keyword search, and the PDFs are searchable, fortunately. But unfortunately, there's not any kind of standard format that would be conducive to scraping or any sort of easy way to do this. Sometimes they look like this, which is very nice. And this is a good example because you can see here, this is Kathleen DuPont. She's a well-credentialed doctor. She's saying positive, that's what that means, and then A, large opacities. That means the most severe form, earliest stage of complicated. But then you've got John Scatteridge, William Scott, and Paul Wheeler, all three at Johns Hopkins, saying, no, it's probably tuberculosis, or, maybe it's some other inflammatory disease, emphysema, histoplasmosis, maybe it's MAC, we don't know, but he should have a biopsy, but it's not black lung. So sometimes they look like this, sometimes they look like this. This is when it's in a paragraph and they're basically just sort of narratively describing what Wheeler sees. So what I ended up doing was just sort of unsophisticated brute force, creating an Excel spreadsheet and logging all of Wheeler's readings in every case. And fortunately, they tell you the date of the X-ray, so you can see what other doctors read that exact same film. And so I would record Wheeler's reading, the other doctor's reading, and then sometimes in that case there was later pathology evidence, which would be a biopsy or an autopsy, and I recorded what that found in the case.
So you're basically saying you hand-built a spreadsheet based on searches of this database, like one at a time, using his name and then the dates.
I would go through these opinions and search for Wheeler, and then I would go, okay, like for this one I would say, I would go through it and say Wheeler says negative, and then probably later down there's another doctor reading this under a different subheading, and so I would type that in. And that was...
How many hours would you say you spent?
It was more like months.
How many reports?
He was involved in 1,500 cases since 2000, and that's as far back as they go. He, in that time, read more than 3,400 films, never once positive for complicated black lung disease. And yeah, so this was a tedious process, to say the least, you might imagine. It resulted in this, which at the center, Chris Zubak-Skis built this, and it was great, and this really tells the story. Red obviously is negative, green's positive, pretty clear. And these minimal, so there are a few times where Wheeler did find minimally positive or possibly minimally positive, but sometimes he said, oh, but it's probably something else, or sometimes it was always reading the very first stage, which the very first stage of disease almost never qualifies you for benefits because you don't, it's not enough to show you have the disease, you have to show disease and that you're totally disabled because of it. So these cases were losses, even when he, acknowledged maybe it's slightly positive. This was all pretty time consuming, but it was also really useful because in reading, this stuff, you learn how Wheeler thinks. You learn about how cases work and how they play out usually. And so you can see themes that pop up in what he's saying, like it involves the pleura, so it can't be black lung. He's making factual claims like that you can check out, which it turns out that's not true. There are a lot of things that aren't true, but they're going unchallenged in these cases because minors can't get qualified doctors to rebut them, and judges don't know the medicine because they're judges. So that was crucial both for identifying a lot of where to look at in terms of do his opinions comport with contemporary science on the issue, which in large part they don't. And he actually, we read him a passage, and he said, I don't know where that comes from. It's just, that's not supported. And we said, well, actually, that comes from the 1979 standards for diagnosing black lung in pathology, so sorry. But it also led to individual cases that I never would have found through traditional means. A lot of times you go looking for your victim for your story and you start calling up plaintiff's attorneys and stuff like that. But Steve Day was completely off the grid. Steve had lost his case almost entirely because of the opinions of the guys at Johns Hopkins. But his lawyer wasn't pressing any sort of appeal. Steve hadn't filed a subsequent claim. He only emerged because I was keeping a list of sort of the cases that looked like the examples where Johns Hopkins most clearly played a key role in the cases. And I just started calling all the minors who had lost these cases, and Steve had maybe the most compelling story. So when we confronted Johns Hopkins with what had we, found, they sort of had the approach of, okay, but we're Johns Hopkins. We're the #1 hospital in the country. Who are you? So, and it was, you better have your facts straight. You better know how to read a pathology report. I do. So we said, we'll show you all the evidence that we've got. Do you have? Okay. We'll show you all the evidence that we've got. We want you to answer some questions too. We said fine. So I spent, a couple days putting together this box of FedEx documents that I sent up to them with a bunch of questions, and nothing. just kept following up with him, no response, no response. Finally, we get this sort of bland statement, and we said, well, one, you promised us all these answers to these questions. You haven't addressed any of them. And furthermore, your statement's even internally inconsistent and vague. Can you please clarify? And they, after I think another week or two went by where we kind of went back and forth with them, and then they finally, their response was to copy and paste the same statement again and send it to us. So, we're like, that's it. So we felt, at that point, we thought, we did have discussions of, are they holding something back? Are they going to slam us after this comes out? But we asked them every possible, bit of exculpatory evidence on their behalf, and they wouldn't answer it. They wouldn't defend themselves. So we've done what we could do. So we ran with it. 2 days later, they suspended their program. The next week, senators began crafting legislation to reform the black lung benefits system. They said they were using the stories in the series as a guide to sort of where to plug holes. Congressmen called for a federal investigation. Earlier this year, the Labor Department came out with a program that would essentially somewhat level the playing field for minors, in theory at least, where they would allow them to get better medical evidence from doctors who are paid by the Labor Department. And then in some cases at the appeals level, it would allow government lawyers to intervene on behalf of minors to make sure that they don't get steamrolled quite so much. And I say quite so much. It's never going to be fully, as long as you have an adversarial system with one side with these resources and the other with this, it's iffy. But and then just a couple of weeks ago, the department announced that it's going to, it's beginning work and plans to issue a rule that will address the disclosure of medical evidence. And they, in an email to stakeholders, specifically mentioned Gary Fox's case, who was the minor featured in the first installment of the series. And so that would address potentially things like what the law firm Jackson Kelly was doing. In terms of sort of takeaways from this whole process for me, I think that a lot of times, and a lot of this may be common sense, and you've probably heard a lot of this before, but sometimes it just helps to think through it or say it again. People in sort of an insular world like the black lung benefits community, which is very small, but I think this is true of other communities as well, kind of take for granted things that they think it's just, that's the way things are. But to someone outside, that would be shocking. Everyone in the black lung system knew about Paul Wheeler. And it was just like, what do we do about that? The government agencies who were involved, people told me on background, they've been trying for 25 years to figure out what to do about Paul Wheeler. So people know about this stuff, but the public doesn't know. And sometimes it's just giving them a little oomph, a nudge maybe. And the public views things with a totally different perspective. And sometimes these people just need a little bit of cover to do what they always wanted to do, frankly. Another thing is, approach to data. I think a lot of times people come to stories and think, all right, I'm going to get this big data set, and then we're going to analyze it, and then we'll see what it tells us, and that'll be the story. That's okay. I've done that too. But I think a lot of the best stories come about when you already have kind of an idea of what the story is, and then you say what data exists or could exist that would help me tell this story. So, for instance, here, there was no data. Turns out I had to do that, horrible spreadsheet that, took 7 years of my life or whatever. But, it was completely worth it, and that was what the story called for. So, trying to do there is a database of claims, but that wouldn't have told me anything. So I think we have to sometimes think creatively about how we're going to provide the quantitative evidence.
Can I ask you, first, this was fantastic, thank you. About Wheeler, you found that he had 1,500 reports or whatever, none of them serious, but did you ever figure out why? I mean, who was he getting paid from, or did he have a response? I mean, you have this terribly smoking gun, which is everybody can look at that and say there's something wrong with that.
Right.
But did you connect that next step, figure out why he was that way? Was he compensated by how much? And
Right. So I should also mention, I forgot to mention that in the biopsy cases, they're very rare. The biopsy or autopsy cases, in the majority of those that there was biopsy evidence, and in almost every conclusive case, Wheeler was wrong. The guy did have black lung, and a lot of times it was not until after the minor applied, lost, died, autopsy showed black lung, and then he won. But to address your question, that was one of the things that we struggled with. It's a unit at Johns Hopkins, and sizes varied from time to time. They charge a lot more than other places for these readings, which you would expect. As far as we can tell, and what Hopkins told us, is that all the money goes to Hopkins, not directly to the doctors. Now, we asked them about bonuses, performance bonuses. They said, no, we don't. I said, well, what about this deposition where your doctor said that you get bonuses for being, quote, productive? And they said, I don't know what that is. And they never really answered it. But I think, and that's one of the things here, is that it's important not to assume people's motivations, because Wheeler, I honestly do not think that Wheeler was motivated by financial considerations primarily. I think if you look at his history, he came up under the tutelage of Dr. Morgan, who became dean of the medical school at Johns Hopkins, is a revered figure in history there, and basically started this radiology unit. And they were doing, and he was his protege, and they were doing this work sort of at a time when there was that first wave of asbestos claims. And so these same principles that you read for black lung can also apply for asbestos reading, for asbestosis, mesothelioma, things like that. And when that first came around, there were plaintiffs' lawyers who would run them through these mills, and they would there was fraud in the asbestos community. And so they sort of took it upon themselves as the defenders of integrity in this system. And Wheeler has testified before Congress about this. And I think they, from a very early time, got this idea that people were trying to get money for something they didn't have. And he expressed that repeatedly through our interviews. And that really seems to be the motivating factor for him. I mean, if you talk with Wheeler, you meet with him, you just check out what he's, his clothes, his lifestyle. I mean, he does not live an extravagant lifestyle like some of these consultants do. I mean, he genuinely seems to believe that he is doing the right thing to keep all these coal miners from getting all this money that they don't deserve.
So he's still there.
It's really unclear what's going on at Johns Hopkins right now, because they won't talk to us, and they're private, so they can do whatever the hell they want. But their unit, as far as we know, is still suspended. They may be facing an investigation by the state medical board, but as far as him, he's still listed on their faculty.
So when you were working on this, you were at the Center for Public Integrity. Okay, and now you're at Buzzfeed.
Right.
Right. So it took 7 years of your life to put all this stuff together, and
That was an exaggeration.
okay, a million, lots of hours of your life. Did the Center for Public Integrity give you the time and resources you needed to do it? And how does it compare to your resources at Buzzfeed when their demand is like to get stuff quickly?
Yeah. Well, there are a number of aspects to that question. At the center, different. I think there are different teams have different sort of metabolisms. Ours was a little bit slower on the team that I was on, which is environment and labor. So the editors that I was working with were completely fine, and they were really great about sort of shielding me from a lot of the other pressures of, you know, day-to-day short-term stuff. And I did do some other stuff while I was working on this, but for the most part I got to devote a huge amount of time to this, which was awesome. At Buzzfeed, I think it will be pretty much the same. That was one of the key points that I discussed with my editor there now before I took the job, and I would not have left the center if I didn't feel like I could do
Something
the
like
same
this.
sort of right. And I flat out said, "Could I do this project?" And he said, "Yeah."
Right.
So the investigative team at Buzzfeed is not the rest of BuzzFeed. You know, my editor is Mark Schuss, who came from ProPublica, was at the Wall Street Journal. Great guy, great editor, gets this kind of stuff, wants, not only he wants, but our editor-in-chief, and, I mean, I had a conversation with Jonah Peretti, the CEO. He wants big projects that make a splash. This is sort of the evolution of the way that they view their company going, from sort of the viral stuff to more hard news to then they did long form last year, and then this year investigative. And they've actually been successful. A lot of their long form stuff, if you look at the analytics on that, people are reading 10,000 word pieces on their mobile devices and sharing it. I mean, I think it sort of is, it defies a lot of the conventional wisdom about the industry today. But yeah, I mean, I've pitched some projects, and there's stuff like this. So
Interesting things.
Yeah, two kind of related questions. How much, when you were just describing Wheeler's background, maybe the kind of culture that he came up in, how much of that did you get into in your stories?
it's in there in the day two story, probably about 3/4 of the way down. I didn't want to dwell on it too much because, you know, never really get inside someone's head. And I didn't want to seem like a, you know, playing psychoanalyst here. But I did think it was important to hint at least, the facts about what we knew about his background and potential motivations.
And then, sort of along the same lines, you know, I find whenever I worked on a project, I've obviously never worked on anything this extensive, but that you have a theory of what's going on and why it's going on, and the way you look at it as a reporter. But then I was also always taught, all right, well, look at what is an alternate explanation that you might not be missing. What is a reason that might be less nefarious that this might be happening? And inevitably, it doesn't sound like Hopkins gave you much defense, but a lot of times the people you're writing about will throw some of those defenses at you. And so how much of that do you include, both to kind of give their side, give an alternate explanation, but also not go so far that you're undermining something that to you as a neutral observer looks like a clear, you know, story that's something that might upset people?
It's a fine line because you want to present a compelling and good and accurate story, but you don't want to put your finger on the scale. You want to give them a chance to fully air everything, and it's ultimately in your interest to put it in the story rather than to have them issue some press release afterwards saying we've done all this stuff. You know how that goes.
Right.
So with Hopkins, when they don't really give you anything to work with, it's really hard.
Right.
With the law firm, they didn't really give me anything. They pretty much flatly refused to comment, but I tried to loop in a lot of what they argued in court filings. And so I think it's sort of, you're obligated to portray their point of view, but if they say something that's just not factually supported,
Right.
you can either, I kind of prefer to, if there's space, put it in and then say this is wrong. And that was the case with some of the stuff with the law firm. Or some of the stuff with the law firm also was sort of more of along the lines of, we're not arguing we don't do this, we're saying we do this and it's legal. And so then I feel like it's kind of my position to say, they do this, they say it's legal, it's ambiguous whether it is legal or not, that's what's being decided in a legal case right now. It's also ambiguous whether it's ethical, and there's another question here, which is whether it's moral. So that's how I try to address that.
I have kind of a boring question, but that big database you built, how did you kind of go back and fact check it? Or did, when you do it by hand like that?
Well, I don't fact check anything. No, we just kind of went through, and it was too much to go back through every decision, but spot checked here and there.
Well, when it came to the data set that you were building, what kind of challenges did you come up with when it came to, realizing what data points you needed to track? And, I know I've done some projects like this, and it's evolved over time.
Yeah, that's how it
And
was.
so I wasn't sure if you faced any of those challenges.
Yeah, definitely. The more you learn it, so what I would say when you're doing something you're building your own database, try and plan it out as much in advance as you can, and then realize that that's going to blow up anyway as you go into it. So I spent some time thinking, this is how I want to do this, but I got in there and I got through a ton of the films, and I realized biopsies are going to be crucial in this because that's what he's saying is the gold standard for diagnosis. So then I had to go back and redo all the stuff with the biopsy. So yes, there's a natural evolution to it, and it's kind of being willing to adapt as you're going, I think. Yep. So, do you have?
Just to follow up then, did you use anything other than Excel once you actually felt like you gathered the complete material?
It was pretty small, so I used Access to just do some SQL queries and stuff.
Okay.
I was just going to ask about when how you know when to stop, because I've never written anything remotely close to like a major years-long investigative piece, and even if it's just like a couple weeks long, sometimes I'll feel like I don't have quite what I need to write the story. Like I'm just waiting for one more thing, or I just want one more thing before I'm ready to go with the big story. Like how do you just say like, okay, we got the smoking gun, or we got what we need? Is that where an editor comes in and says like you gotta do something, or like how do you draw that line?
Yeah, sometimes. That's kind of the thing with reporters is like we would go on reporting forever.
Yeah, right.
We were allowed to,
write
but
the story, you just kind of do it.
I think it's the same. Like when you start hearing the same thing over and over again, that's a good sign, whether it's from the documents, data, or interviews. But holding out for this one, I got to get. If I just get this one piece of information, it's going to nail it.
Find out what motivations was
Right. I could have held out forever trying to figure out why is Wheeler the way he is.
Right.
Ultimately, I think it's kind of a cost-benefit analysis of what do I have right now? If I got everything that I wanted from what I'm holding out for, what's the best story that I can tell with that, and how much better would it be than the story that I've already got? So.
When you were taking the job to be on Buzzfeed's investigative team, sorry to keep going back to this one.
No,
There was a question.
I'm surprised there weren't more.
What did you like? What drew you to that position? It sounds like a risk to go from a place where you're doing this kind of thing, and it seems like that's what the institute was all about, the center, and now to BuzzFeed. So, what was it that gave you so much confidence in BuzzFeed's investigative goals that let you lead?
The people. I was very skeptical. They contacted me late. last year. Talked with him for months. I met with him a few times. Went up to New York. Met with the editor-in-chief, some of the other people who already joined the team, and we had a lot of conversations about story ideas and just what kind of journalism we want to do. And I had a lot of questions about, are you really committed to this? Because investigative journalism takes a lot of time and it costs a lot of money, and it's not going to bring you as many hits as what you're already doing, and it's going to take a lot longer than what you're already doing and cost a lot more money. And they legitimately said, we wanted to enhance our overall brand, and we want to be one of the 21st century media companies, and we feel like an integral part of that is having a serious side, and they've got a lot of resources to do this stuff that they're willing to throw at it. They went out and hired great people. That was probably the thing that drew me more than anything, was who else was going to be on the team with me. And then, like I said, a lot of questions about, okay, so say something breaks, am I going to have to chase that? No. If I come across something like this, are you going to give me a year to look into it, even if I don't know exactly what I have going into it? Yes. Go to West Virginia and stay there for a month if you want. It's they've said the right things. We'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see how it goes.
Did you get that in writing?
Oral contract. Sure.
Knowing what you know now, if you had to do the story again, what would you have done differently?
I think that I would have tried to develop a much more detailed profile of Dr. Wheeler early on. I would have done a lot more to try to reach out to former students, colleagues, to sort of do a lot of the psychoanalysis stuff that I was talking about earlier. In general, be a little bit more organized, but I think we always feel that way. But if you saw my desk at the time, you would realize that it was total disarray. It was chaos. But I don't know. You got me in a self-reflective mood now. I'll have to think about it.
Just two practical questions. You mentioned Gary Fox. How did you come across him? How did you find him?
I think the first way was I was doing the reporting for the earlier series on the resurgence, and one of the lawyers we were talking to was representing some guys that we were talking to, and he said, you've got to look at this case. And he sent the civil complaint they've filed a lawsuit against Jackson Kelly for fraud in West Virginia State Court, which is ongoing. So looking at that, and they lay out the facts, and we're just like, God, this can't be real, but yeah.
And then you had the photos of everything when you visited the NIOSH truck. You're working on a story that could potentially cast a really negative light on the whole process here and how these cases get decided. So how do you convince them to get you access and let you in there? Was it just that early in the process, or did you not tell them the full extent of what the story was going to look like?
No, the NIOSH people actually, they're not involved in the benefits program at all. So they're simply screening for their own epidemiological data. But yeah, a lot of these, and then a lot of the people wouldn't really talk to me, but the Labor Department actually was fairly cooperative because I think they knew that there were a lot of these problems, but they didn't know what to do about them, or they didn't have the public cover to do what they wanted to do about them. So, they actually, usually I have a kind of a friendly adversarial relationship with the labor department, but this one was a little bit different because it was kind of like they were glad that I was doing this, which was bizarre and maybe uncomfortable.
Yeah, there must be a trick, right? Like,
Sorry to go back to Wheeler. I'm just fascinated by this. Do you have a sense now that this is over that he knew that he was wrong? I mean, I guess the pathology proved that he was wrong, like rather than just suggested it. Did he know that? I mean, had he hidden that? Does he really believe that he was right on these thousands of cases?
I think he either really believes he was right, or one of his primary arguments is that the statute that set up the benefit system is so screwed up because it doesn't require biopsies, and that should be the only way to really die. You should only get benefits if you've gone through a biopsy and it says that you've had it. So he would say, working within the system that we have, I did the right thing.
I wanted to ask you what kind of projects you're drawn to, or where you look for story ideas, or you just have a lot built up now over time?
Yeah, I mean, some of it's, I'll just like read something that's in the news and think, a lot of times it's like the last 2 or 3 paragraphs where there's some sort of throwaway thing that the reporter thinks isn't important but is actually really interesting, and I'll kind of save that. And some of it, a lot of times it's just like areas that I find personally interesting, and I'll go reading about what's going on, from a regulatory standpoint with, the FDA or whatever it is. I think a lot of good stuff, actually, it's, if you can stomach it, reading stuff like policy directives. I have a printed out and marked up copy of the OSHA Field Operations Manual, which sounds ridiculous, but actually if you go through there, you can see how inspectors are supposed to record everything, and then it says stuff like they will record X, Y, and Z in database this name, so then you say, oh, well, what's this database? And then that can lead to stuff. And then obviously just talking to a lot of people, and especially a lot of former people, so like former government officials, which are everywhere in this city, and people who used to work at prominent companies and stuff like that.
Do you plan on doing a follow-up at Buzzfeed on this with what happens to Wheeler and Johns Hopkins?
So yeah, all the follow-ups. BuzzFeed is very interested in that, and we've worked out an arrangement where I will do a story and it'll run on BuzzFeed and the Center, and we actually did that with the rulemaking story last week. So it ran on BuzzFeed and CPI.
Have you boxed out ABC?
I knew I was going to get that. I love them so much.
Well, having spent most of my life in West Virginia, thank you for doing this series, especially the Jackie Kelly piece. I was curious, a lot of the coal miners I talked to were saying that, over time they would, a lot of them, once they went down into their own mine, they would start out with a respirator, but then it really quickly gets too hot, and many of them take it off within a few days of the order period. Is it a matter of like the technology is not keeping up with the respirator technology is not keeping up with?
Yeah, well, so I've heard from a lot of guys, they chew. So you got to lift it up when you spit.
Yeah, sure.
If you have a beard or any kind of facial hair, it doesn't seal properly. There have been lawsuits against respirator companies because they're alleging that they're just faulty, inadequate. Sometimes those respirator companies have then come back and actually, in an interesting development, looped in the coal companies saying, our respirators work, but you're exposing these guys to such ridiculous amounts of dust that there's no way that anything can stop it. But ultimately, respirators, so you have this hierarchy of controls in occupational safety and health, and personal protective equipment is at the very it's like the last resource that you're not really supposed to use. So there are a lot of things you can do before you get to that point, like proper ventilation, having your water sprays work on all your machines. So and those things just don't happen because they take time and cost money.
As an investigative reporter, how often do you FOIA things, and what have you found to be like good agencies where you actually get timely responses for your FOIAs?
That's what, if any.
Yeah, I do file a lot of FOIAs, probably to an obnoxious degree. But usually I will call in advance. I'll try and figure out what exists. So like I was saying, through like program directives, or sometimes they just have on their websites, or instructions to their employees and field operations manuals and things like that. You can figure out what exists, and then it's often better to not just say, give me something about blah, blah, blah. If you can say this specific thing, that helps. And I always mention that I'm willing to narrow it, and I try and talk with them on the phone. So I've had mixed experiences. And there are within agencies, there are different FOIA offices. So right now I'm dealing with the EPA Office of General Counsel, which is great. I'm also dealing with EPA's Air office, which so it's like a whole different universe. There's someone who's good at wage and hour. There's someone who's good at OSHA. There are horrible people at those agencies too. But USGS, but never FOIA the State Department. Oh my God. Actually, you should, and then you should sue them. We're concerned because I celebrated the second birthday of FOIA a few months ago. Yeah, I gave him a little cake. Yeah, it's just ridiculous. Some of this stuff is ridiculous. So like the State Department and a lot of the Department of Justice, like just forget about it. And some people, I've actually talked to lawyers our in-house lawyers said that the State Department, you might want to consider just suing them because people a lot of times do that to move to the front of the queue. So.
Jeez.
May I ask you, back to your story, is there any possibility for people whose cases are green dots on your graph, maybe they're dead now, is there any possibility of a class action suit against either Johns Hopkins or the law firm?
There are plaintiffs' attorneys sniffing around, and they've called me, yeah. And they've called people like Steve, and some of the people mentioned in the stories. Also, because the disease is progressive, it's specifically defined in the regulations as latent and progressive. You can file subsequent claims if you can prove that you got worse, or that something was improperly adjudicated in the previous proceeding. So Steve's filed a new claim. And the doctor again for the Labor Department said you have the most severe form of black lung, but in addition, your breathing has gotten a lot worse. Now he's scheduled, I think this week or next week, to go to a coal company doctor, because that's what you have to do.
And when you say, when they're filing, they're seeking, I assume, benefits that would pay for their health care and would pay them some kind of disability. But is there any, like once they're dead, can their families get disability? How much money is on the line?
So that's, I think, the shocking thing for a lot of people is because this is a workers' comp program. It's a remedial program that was specifically, the feds carved this out. Normally stuff would go through the state workers' comp, but because these guys are at such risk, the feds said we're going to have this specific program for them. But as a workers' comp program, the liability for the coal company is capped really low. Actually, and it goes up periodically, but right now, if you're a minor, it would be about $600 or $650 a month is what you would get. If you have 3 or more dependents, it would be $1,250 a month, and that's the most you can get. So if you have 5, 6, 7 kids, you get $1,250. That's
Is that in addition to medical care?
plus medical care. Yeah.
When you're buying lining up projects and you're going to do something that's going to take months and months of your time. I mean, how do you vet what projects are out there to potentially pursue? How do you decide which one you're going to do, and then like how much time do you spend in between projects, kind of going through that process to decide what's next?
Yeah, that's where I'm at right now, and it's kind of nerve-wracking. It's, you have all these ideas, and then you kind of really go up there and just poke at them repeatedly and let other people poke at them, specifically your editor a lot of times. And on our team, fortunately, we've sent around all our ideas to all the other reporters, and they've weighed in, and it's been great. I mean, the other people on our team at Buzzfeed are terrific. And so it's kind of just this, you can't always know what you're going to get, because looking at this, I originally conceived of this as just the lawyer's story. And it wasn't until months into the reporting when I saw Hopkins and some of this other stuff. So I think you can't always wait for the perfect story, because you can't know that it's the perfect story in advance, but you also have to do sort of this, if everything falls through, just given what I know now, what's the best story that I could tell, and is it worth X amount of time?
And you start doing reporting on different stories and then decide which one seems to hold the most promise?
Yeah, that's what I'm doing now.
Obviously, we're all after impact journalism, and we want to see the changes to some of the things that we discover are corrupt or wrong or whatever. On the other hand, we're expected to be sort of unbiased purveyors of this information. Like when you're talking about plaintiffs' attorneys calling you up and being like, "Hey, we got this class action going." How do you have those conversations? Do you say yeah, go get him, or are you like, I can't really talk to you about this?
Yeah, I mean, so after this has happened, I mean, I've had government agencies and attorneys and stuff call me up with stuff like that, and what I said is basically, I can talk to you about what I've published and explain it if that's not clear to you. I can't provide you any more information. I'm certainly not going to help you. Right. If you file a lawsuit, it's probably newsworthy, and I'll report on it. But I think people generally get that. I haven't really had a lot of problems with that.
That's good.
The West Virginia water crisis, did it bring more attention to your reporting, or sort of divert more political and attention away from Black Lawn?
I don't know that it really focused attention on this, other than it's just sort of another one of the unaccounted for externalities of coal.
Other questions?
I know this is pretty really early since you won your award and everything. Do you feel like you get kind of buttonholed into these sort of issues, like all these reports coming out now about soldiers in Iraq and the dust and things like that? Do people think, oh, let's call Chris?
No, I was actually looking at that story, but I decided not to do it. Some, but and I am, I'm trying not to become the coal guy or the people getting sick or blown up guy, because that's a lot of what I've done. But I have pretty broad interest, but it's hard. You get tips after this. It's hard to not follow them. But yeah, I mean, I definitely plan to branch out beyond just mining and dust and industrial accidents and stuff like that.
Are you going to continue to focus on environmental kinds of stories, or are you even going to broaden that?
Some of the projects I pitch are environmental.
Mm-hmm.
Some are labor, and some are criminal justice, way out there. I mean, just completely different stuff.
You've been given this carte blanche, basically, time-wise. How do you juggle, you want to do another year-long project that wins the Pulitzer and has all these impacts, but you often don't know until you're 3 months in until whether it could be a giant project or a medium. So do you start with a bunch of mediums, or are you really just keeping your powder dry until you find one that you jump into?
I think it's sort of you're poking at multiple things, and then maybe I think at some point it would have emerged that among the things that I was looking at, this was the most promising, and so I probably would have then focused most of my attention on that. But recognizing that as you go along, it may be something that, like this, I realized, oh, I need a lot more time for this. This is a really significant story. Or you might get along partway through it and realize it's a good story, but I should just wrap it up in a few months. And then you just move on to some of the other stuff.
Anybody else? Going once, going twice. Chris, this was terrific. Thank you so much.